around the nation and the world. The legacy, life, and ministry of the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is being recognized on the 54th anniversary of the assassination of, without a doubt, the most prophetic man of his time. I'm Tyrone Bowman. This is Tyrone Bowman Tonight. This evening I'll be talking about the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Around the nation and around the world, homage, recognition, respect is being given to a man who, without a doubt, stood for love, peace, and justice. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., mortal shooting of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., the most prominent leader of the American Civil Rights Movement, on April 4th, 1968, as he stood on the second floor balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, where he had come to lead a march by striking sanitation workers. In response to King's death, more than 100 American inner cities exploded in rioting, looting, and violence. James L. Ray, a career small-time criminal who became the object of a more than 2-month manhunt before he was captured in England, pled guilty to the shooting and received a 99-year prison sentence. He quickly recanted his plea and spent the rest of his life claiming that he had been framed by a conspiracy that was really responsible for King's assassination. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the earth-shaking events of 1968 that made it among the most tumultuous and momentous years in American history. The Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, and the anti-war movement were all in full swing as the year began. King's opposition to the Vietnam War had been building steadily since 1965, though initially he was reluctant to prominently criticize the conduct of the war by President Lyndon B. Johnson, who had been a key ally in the effort to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. When the war effort began to rob funding from Johnson's Great Society plan, however, King became a more vocal critic, and his opposition to the war grew to embrace a more radical critique of what he saw as U.S. militarism, imperialism. King also took American capitalism to task and began portraying inequality in economic as well as racial terms. Beyond Vietnam, the address that he gave at Riverside Church in New York City on April 4th, 1967, exactly 1 year before his death, brought all these elements together in a speech that made manifest his opposition to the war. A number of mainstream publications, including the New York Times and the Washington Post, thought King had gone too far with his speech. He had already begun to find himself betwixt and between. Many whites saw him as a dangerous radical. On the other hand, despite his increasingly radical message, a growing number of militant African Americans had become impatient with his nonviolent methods and what they saw as a lack of success in his civil rights efforts in northern cities. It had been several years since his southern triumphs in the Montgomery bus boycott and the Birmingham campaign and the Selma March. In November 1967, King's concern with economic inequality led him and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to mount a Poor People's Campaign, which was to culminate in a massive march on Washington, D.C. Before that could happen, other events of early 1968 interceded. On January 30, North Vietnam launched the Tet Offensive, a widespread attack in South Vietnam that put the Americans and South Vietnamese on their heels for weeks. The pervasiveness of this shocking assault and especially the images of fighting in and around the United States Embassy in Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City, dramatically believed, or belied, pardon me, dramatically belied the U.S. government's contention that the Americans and the South Vietnamese had the war well in hand. Opposition to the war led to Johnson's defeat by anti-war candidate Senator Eugene McCarthy in the March 1968 Democratic presidential primary in New Hampshire, followed by the announcement of the candidacy of Senator Robert F. Kennedy on March the 16th, and the withdrawal of Johnson's candidacy March 31st. Meanwhile, Republican frontrunner Richard Nixon's popularity grew with the silent majority who opposed social change and supported the war. Against this backdrop, and that of the previous year's rioting in New York and Newark, King interrupted the planning of the Poor People's March to travel to Memphis in support of a strike by sanitation workers. Sanitation workers in Memphis, most of whom were African Americans, and received a paltry wage of about $1 per hour, conducted a strike for better wages and working conditions in 1966, but failed to gain sufficient community support. The sanitation changed after a pair of sanitation workers who had been sheltering from the rain by crouching inside the loading hopper of their garbage truck were crushed because of a malfunctioning switch. This time, the strike that resulted in response to their deaths was supported by some 150 local clergymen. The group's leader, the Reverend James Lawson, asked King, his friend, for support, and on March 18th, King addressed a crowd of between 15,000 and 25,000 people, which was said to be the largest indoor gathering in the history of the civil rights movement to that date. King returned to Memphis on March 28th to join Lawson in leading a march in support of the strike. Violence erupted. Early in the demonstration, looting broke out and police shot and killed a 16-year-old boy. King was reluctantly spirited away to safety. Dozens of others were injured as police dispensed tear gas and wielded batons while pursuing demonstrators inside the Claiborne Temple. Blame for the outbreak of violence, which marred King's reputation for nonviolent protests, was placed by many on the back organizing project known as the Invaders, a local Black Panther Party-inspired organization. The next day, strikers returned to the daily demonstrations carrying placards that read, "I am a man," and reporters asked King if he would be able to keep the Poor People's Campaign in Washington peaceful. He met with representatives of the Invaders, who claimed not to have investigated the violence and with whom King agreed to coordinate efforts as plans begun for a follow-up march. Having returned to his home base in Atlanta, King contemplated not going back to Memphis. The planning for the Poor People's Campaign was escalating. At a meeting on March 30th, however, he decided that he needed to see through his commitment to the effort in Memphis. And after some dissent, the leadership of the SCLC agreed. King had come to see the struggle in Memphis as emblematic of the objectives of the Poor People's Campaign. On April 3rd, King was back in Memphis, where the city government had sought an injunction to prevent him from leading another march. The departure from his flight from Atlanta that morning had been delayed to allow a search of the luggage and plane for possible explosives. King was no stranger to death threats, but they had increased since he emphasized his opposition to the Vietnam War. Indeed, before leaving for Memphis, King had informed his wife and his parents that a price supposedly had been put on his head. That night, a rally was scheduled at Bishop Charles H. Mason's Church of God in Christ Temple, a Memphis Pentecostal church. And this is me talking now, not Britannica. The Church of God in Christ was founded by the late Bishop Charles Harrison Mason, who had come from a long, long line of individuals who were deeply involved in standing for justice and equality. Mason Temple, as it became known, was named in honor of the founder of the Church of God in Christ, the largest Black Pentecostal church in the world to date. And now back to the written script here. That night, a rally was scheduled at Bishop Charles Mason Temple, a Memphis Pentecostal church. King was exhausted, had had a sore throat, and was feeling ill. With a thunderstorm raging that it was anticipated to hold down the turnout, he sent his best friend and chief lieutenant, the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, to speak in his stead. When Abernathy arrived at the church, he found a larger than expected crowd buzzing with excitement at the prospect of hearing King. Abernathy telephoned King, asked him to come, and promised that he would give the major address, leaving King to say but a few words, and King agreed. At the event, King spoke for more than 40 minutes, almost completely off the cuff, gathering energy and energizing his audience as he went, ultimately delivering one of his most emotionally soaring and rhetorically brilliant speeches. He began the address, which became known as the Mountaintop Speech, by considering his moment in history versus other times that he might have had lived, and concluded that the last half of the 20th century was where he wanted to be. He then located the Memphis sanitation strike within the long struggle for human freedom and the battle for economic justice, invoking the New Testament parable of the Good Samaritan to stress the need for selfless involvement. He called for unity, stressing the power it provided. Then he recalled the attempt on his life in 1958, when a deranged woman stabbed him with a letter opener that nearly penetrated his aorta, leaving him, as characterized at the time, a sneeze away from death. He remembered a letter from a white high school student telling him that she was glad that he did not sneeze, saying that he was too glad that he had not sneezed. He reflected on some of the momentous civil rights triumphs in which he would have not participated, including his I Have a Dream speech, had he not lived. Finally, as he wound to a close, his speech became prophetic. Quote, "We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop like anybody. I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." Both the audience and King himself were deeply moved. When he finished speaking, King returned to his seat, sat next to his civil rights leader, Benjamin Hooks, who said he saw tears rolling down King's cheeks. On April 23, 1967, in the same month, King gave his speech at Riverside Church. The man who would become his assassin, James Earl Ray, escaped from the maximum security Missouri State Penitentiary by hiding beneath the false bottom of a prison bakery bread box. Ray, a small-time career criminal from a poor family who had already served 2 prison terms, was 7 years into a 20-year sentence for a grocery store armed robbery at the time of his escape. Once free, he traveled to Chicago, Montreal, Birmingham, Alabama, Puerto Rico, Vallarta, Mexico, and on to Los Angeles, financing his life on the lam with money he had saved in prison from selling contraband, probably smuggled drugs, and by committing more robberies. All the while, Ray, a consummate loner, successfully maintained the low profile necessary to prolong his life as a fugitive. As Eric Starvo gulped, he rented lodging, obtained a driver's license, visited a doctor, took dancing lessons, and attended bartending school. However, it may have been fame rather than freedom that Ray sought. A rabid consumer of news, he was reportedly greatly disappointed that he had not landed on the FBI's most wanted list. According to many sources, including family members, Ray was deeply racist. While in California, he became enamored of the third-party presidential candidacy of segregationist George Wallace, whose campaign he volunteered. His support for Wallace was twinned with a special enmity for King, whose civil rights success in Alabama Ray saw as affronts to Wallace, that state's governor. Some of Ray's prison friends said later that King's appearance on television would send Ray into a rage. At some point during Ray's stay in California, his hatred for King apparently spiked, and on March or about the 17th in 1968, he began making his way to Atlanta. Once there, he became obsessed with King, circling his home on a map along with Ebenezer Baptist Church, where King was co-pastor with his father, and the SCLC headquarters. Observers speculated that Ray may have decided that killing King would somehow benefit Wallace's candidacy or prolong segregation. Undoubtedly, Ray was well aware of King's involvement in the sanitation strike in Memphis. After traveling to Birmingham to purchase a scoped 30 caliber Remington rifle, Ray, who had learned to shoot in the Army, followed King to Memphis. Last but not least, Ray learned from media reports that while in Memphis, King would be staying at room 306 of the Lorraine Motel using the name John Willard between 3 o'clock and 3:30 p.m. on April 4th. Ray checked into room 5B of Bessie Brewer's rooming house, the back windows which faced the Lorraine Motel across Mulberry Street. According to the most plausible speculation of Ray's subsequent action, he likely determined that the window of the common bathroom at the back of the second floor of the boarding house north wing provided the best available sight line to room 306. After purchasing binoculars at a sporting goods store at around 4 p.m., Ray probably monitored the rain from his room. He did not have to wait long. At about 5 p.m., King and Abernathy emerged from the room they shared on the motel's second floor, on their way to have dinner at a local minister's home. King teased Jesse Jackson about not appropriately dressed for dinner, and while passing on the balcony, chatted with people in the courtyard below. During these moments, Ray is thought to have made his way to the bathroom, bolstered his rifle on the windows above the bathtub, and shot. Residents of the boarding house later testified they had heard someone repeatedly walking toward or using the bathroom at 6:01 p.m. As he stood on the balcony, King was mortally wounded by a bullet that entered the right side of his face, fractured his jaw, exited his lower face, and re-entered his body through the neck area, severing vital arteries and causing multiple fractures to his spine. Abernathy and an undercover Memphis police officer tried to stem the bleeding of the falling King with a towel. King was rushed to St. Joseph Hospital, where emergency surgery proved futile. At 7:05 p.m., King was officially pronounced dead. The anguish and in response to the news of King's murder spread fast and furiously throughout the United States. For many, his death seemed to signal the end of the hope that nonviolent means could bring about a better world for African Americans. America's black inner cities exploded. Over the next several days, more than 100 cities experienced significant outbreaks of rioting, arson, looting, and violence. In all, some 27,000 people were arrested, about 3,500 were injured, and more than 40 were killed. Some 6,100 people were arrested, and more than 1,000 were injured in the national capital alone. In Chicago, there were some 125 fires and 11 deaths. In Baltimore, more than 5,000 federal troops patrolled the city in an attempt to forestall arson, only after police forces around the country had been reinforced by 58,000 U.S. National Guard and Army troops did the violence subside. King's death resulted in the temporary suspension of the 1968 presidential campaign. The Academy Award ceremony was postponed. Businesses, schools, and other public buildings were closed. April 7th was declared a national day of mourning by President Johnson. The next day, King's widow, Coretta Scott King, led thousands in a march in Memphis commemorating her husband and supporting the traffic sanitation workers. On April 9th, a 7-and-1-hour series of funeral rites for King was held in Atlanta, beginning with a private funeral at the Ebenezer Baptist Church. Abernathy opened the service by saying that one of the darkest hours of mankind was at hand. In accordance with a request from Mrs. King, a tape recording was played of a sermon that King had delivered some 2 months earlier, Drum Major Instinct, in which he again prophetically outlined the sort of funeral he wanted for himself, including suggestions for his eulogy. In attendance at the private ceremony were four presidential candidates: Kennedy, McCarthy, Nixon, and Vice President Hubert Humphrey, along with other prominent politicians, public servants, civil rights leaders, celebrities from the world of entertainment and sports, and foreign dignitaries. After the service, King's casket was carried by a mule-drawn wagon for 4 miles, or 6 kilometers, through downtown Atlanta to his alma mater, Morehouse College. En route to procession was joined by bystanders and may have swelled to as many as 100,000 people. On the way it passed the state's capital, inside of which Georgia's segregationist governor Lester Maddox was holed up, surrounded by armed troops whom he had deployed because of the fear that the funeral would engender violence. At Morehouse, an outdoor memorial service was performed. Former Morehouse President Benjamin Mays delivered the eulogy, and Mahalia Jackson, about whom King had once said, "A voice like hers comes along once in a millennium," sang the gospel standard, "Precious Lord." Ladies and gentlemen, the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the apostle of nonviolence, the apostle of love. I'm Tyrone Bowman. Never surrender, never quit.